They had planned the perfect weekend getaway. A group of friends, ready to escape the suffocating heat of the city for the crystalline waters and tranquil shores of Lake Clearwater. It was the summer of 2008, a time of carefree youth, of nascent adulthood, of endless possibilities. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, a caravan of 2 cars packed with camping gear, coolers, and the unshakable optimism that comes with a new adventure. The sun, a burning copper disk in the sky, glittered off the lake's surface as they pulled up to their secluded campsite. It was a place of breathtaking, almost deceptive beauty. A dense forest of pines and oaks bordered the shore, their branches reaching toward the water as if in a silent, ancient plea. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, was a welcome relief. For the 5 friends, Sarah, Mark, Jessica, Ryan, and Chris, this was to be a moment of pure, unadulterated freedom, a final hurrah before the responsibilities of college and careers descended upon them. They set up their tents, a flurry of laughter and minor arguments over tent poles, and then, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they lit a bonfire. The flames danced in the encroaching darkness, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to whisper secrets from the surrounding woods. They roasted marshmallows, told ghost stories, and listened to music, the sound of their youthful voices carrying across the silent lake. The night was a tapestry of stars, a canvas of celestial wonder, and they felt utterly, completely alive. As midnight approached, a sense of quiet contentment settled over the group. The music was turned down. The ghost stories faded into shared memories, and the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the gentle lapping of the water. This was the moment that would be remembered, the one that would live on in photographs and future conversations. But it was also the moment that would be looked back upon with a profound sense of sorrow, a final flickering image of a life that was about to be tragically extinguished. The next morning, a Saturday, the serenity remained. The morning light filtered through the trees, creating a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor. They spent the day as one might expect, swimming in the cool, clear water, hiking a trail that promised a panoramic view of the lake, and fishing from the shore. It was a day filled with simple joys and shared experiences. Sarah, the most adventurous of the group, was a natural leader, her laughter echoing through the trees as she challenged Mark to a foot race on the trail. Jessica and Ryan, a couple whose love story was still in its early chapters, walked hand in hand, their hushed conversations a testament to their budding romance. And Chris, the quiet one, the observer, simply took it all in, a small, knowing smile on his face. He carried a battered old camera, a relic from a bygone era, and captured moments that now exist only as faded, haunting memories. In the late afternoon, as a gentle breeze began to stir the leaves, they decided to take out the small motorized boat they had rented. It was a simple vessel, a white fiberglass hull with a small outboard motor, nothing more than a toy on a lake so vast. Sarah, Mark, and Chris climbed in, their faces lit with excitement. Jessica and Ryan chose to stay on shore, content to watch the boat as it became a shrinking white dot against the emerald backdrop of the water. It was to be a short trip, a quick jaunt to the other side of the lake and back. They promised to return before dusk, before the fireflies began their nightly dance. But they never did. The sun set, the sky turning a bruised shade of purple and orange, and the boat did not return. The silence that had once been so comforting now felt ominous, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. Jessica and Ryan waited, their initial amusement giving way to a gnawing anxiety. They called out, their voices swallowed by the vast, unfeeling wilderness. They walked the shoreline, their flashlights cutting trembling cones of light through the deepening darkness. But there was no answer, no sign, only the silent indifference of the lake. They waited all through the night, a desperate vigil by the cold remnants of the fire. The next morning, a Sunday, they called the local authorities. The initial response was one of calm, almost clinical professionalism. The park rangers, the local police, they had seen this before. People lost their way, boats broke down, they would be found. The first search was swift and organized. Helicopters flew low over the water, their rotors beating a rhythmic tattoo against the silence. Search parties, a mix of law enforcement and volunteers, combed the shoreline, their eyes scanning every inch of the dense forest. But they found nothing. No overturned boat, no discarded life jackets, no trace of the three friends. The lake, they said, was deep. The currents were strong. A boat could have sunk without a trace, its passengers pulled into the unforgiving depths. This became the initial narrative, the one that offered a semblance of an answer, a clean, tragic conclusion. But it was a conclusion that failed to satisfy the families of the missing. They knew their children, they said. They would have found a way, they would have left a sign. This was not a simple accident, this was something else. This was a mystery that was only just beginning to unfold. The investigation stalled, then faded, then went cold. The authorities, having exhausted all conventional avenues, closed the case. The official file, a stack of paper filled with unanswered questions, was sealed and placed in a dusty filing cabinet. But for the families, the case remained agonizingly open. They clung to the fragments of their children's last moments, the photographs, the text messages, the whispered promises of a future that would never come to pass. They hired private investigators, consulted psychics, and returned to Lake Clearwater year after year, their hope a fragile, flickering flame against the relentless storm of their grief. The lake, once a symbol of freedom and joy, had become a monument to their loss, a vast and silent tomb. Time, the relentless thief, stole not only the lives of the three friends, but the sharp edges of the tragedy itself. The newspapers moved on to other stories, the public memory faded, and the case of the Lake Clearwater Five became little more than a whisper, a local legend told around campfires. But the families never forgot. For them, the silence was a constant presence, a hollow ache in their hearts. They had been told to accept the unimaginable, to mourn what they couldn't comprehend, but they could not. They needed answers, not for closure, but for justice. They needed to know what had happened in that vast and beautiful wilderness, and for 6 long years they would wait. 6 years passed, a period of agonizing, unanswered grief. The families of Sarah, Mark, and Chris had endured the slow, grinding erosion of hope. The initial surge of public sympathy had long since evaporated, replaced by the hushed whispers of a small town that had learned to live with its own ghost story. The lake, once a summer destination, was now a place of morbid fascination, a silent testament to a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved. For Jessica and Ryan, the two friends who had stayed behind, the trauma had been a permanent, defining weight. They had become unwilling historians of the tragedy, their lives a living archive of the last moments of their friends. They were the last to see them, the last to hear their voices, the last to witness the boat as it receded into the vast expanse of the water. Their memories, once precious and vibrant, had been twisted into a source of torment. They were constantly replaying those final hours, searching for a clue they might have missed, a warning sign they failed to see. The guilt, a corrosive poison, ate away at their spirits. They had moved away, sought new lives, but the past was an unshakable shadow. The anniversary of the disappearance was a day of solemn ritual, a time to return to the lake, to stand on the shore and throw flowers onto the unfeeling water. It was an act of defiance against the silence, a final desperate plea for the truth. In the spring of 2014, a new technology, once relegated to the realm of military intelligence and hobbyist enthusiasts, began to find a new purpose. Drones, small remote-controlled aircraft equipped with high-resolution cameras, were becoming more accessible. They were capable of reaching places that human beings could not, of providing a bird's-eye view of landscapes that were too vast or too treacherous to explore on foot. For a small, independent search and rescue group, a collective of volunteers united by a shared sense of mission, the drone was not a toy, but a tool of immense potential. They called themselves lake finders, a simple name for a difficult and often thankless task. The group's founder, a retired police detective named David Miller, had spent his career grappling with cold cases, with the infuriating silence of the unresolved. He saw the drone as a way to circumvent the old limitations, to revisit cases that had been declared hopeless. He had been following the story of the Lake Clearwater Five for years, drawn in by the haunting lack of a single piece of evidence. The official report, which concluded with the words "accidental drowning," struck him as a profound act of professional resignation. Miller and his team of two, a drone pilot named Ben and a data analyst named Chloe, arrived at Lake Clearwater in the early summer of 2014. The lake was as still and silent as the families remembered. The air was thick with humidity, the trees a deep, vibrant green. They set up their base camp on a small patch of grass near the public boat launch, a place that held no painful memories for them. Their approach was methodical, almost clinical. They would not be searching for ghosts, but for data. The drone, a small multi-rotor craft with a camera gimbal, was their eyes in the sky. Ben, a man with the steady hands of a surgeon and the focus of a sniper, would guide it through a pre-programmed grid pattern, meticulously scanning every square foot of the lake's surface and the surrounding shoreline. They began their search on a Tuesday, a day of cloudless, oppressive heat. The drone, a faint buzzing sound against the silence, ascended into the sky. It moved slowly, deliberately, capturing thousands of high-resolution images. Chloe, sitting at a folding table with her laptop, watched the live feed with a keen, analytical eye. For 3 days they found nothing but the mundane details of a tranquil summer lake, a lone fisherman in a canoe, a family picnicking on the shore, the deep green of the water's surface. The search felt futile, a quixotic mission against the forces of time and nature. But Miller, the seasoned veteran of so many failed searches, knew that patience was the only currency that mattered. On the 4th day, as the sun began its slow descent, the drone's flight path took it over a remote, rocky outcrop on the lake's western shore. It was an area that had been searched on foot countless times, a place of jagged rocks and dense undergrowth that offered no obvious hiding places. But from the air, the perspective was different. Ben, watching the feed on his screen, saw something that made him freeze. It was a glint of white, a sharp, unnatural angle against the dark canvas of the forest floor. He zoomed in, the image becoming clearer, more defined. It was the corner of something man-made, something that didn't belong in the natural landscape. He lowered the drone, a whisper of a sound now, and the image on the screen resolved into a horrifying, impossible truth. It was the white fiberglass hull of a boat, but it was not on the water. It was nestled deep in the undergrowth, half buried beneath a layer of fallen leaves and pine needles, its nose smashed against the base of a towering oak tree. The image was a visceral shock, a cold jolt of adrenaline that cut through the mundane silence of the search. The boat, the very vessel that was supposed to have sunk in the lake, had been found on land. But how? How could a boat, a motorized vehicle of any kind, have traveled so far inland without anyone noticing? How could it have been so perfectly hidden, so completely missed by every single search party, every aerial sweep? This discovery shattered the entire narrative of the case. It was no longer a simple boating accident. This was something far more sinister, a mystery that had been intentionally, methodically concealed. The initial, comfortable truth was now a shattered lie, and the real story, the one that had been waiting for 6 years, was about to begin. The silence that had once defined the case was now a screaming question, a demand for answers that would lead them down a far darker path. The discovery of the boat, nestled improbably within the dense foliage of the forest, ripped a hole through the carefully constructed narrative of the Lake Clearwater tragedy. It was a revelation that brought with it a profound sense of disorientation, a feeling that the very ground beneath the investigators' feet was no longer stable. The first responders, a mix of local police and Miller's search and rescue team, stood in a stunned tableau, their faces grim, their flashlights casting an ethereal glow on the wreckage. The boat was a ghost, a phantom of the past that had now, 6 years later, materialized with a shocking and terrifying clarity. It was a small, white fiberglass vessel, its hull marred by scratches and gashes, its front end caved in from a violent impact. It was not at the bottom of the lake, as everyone had believed, but half submerged in the damp earth, as if it had been buried by some unseen force. The scene was one of almost unnatural silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the hushed, awestruck voices of the investigators. They moved with a new sense of purpose, their previous methodical calm replaced by a feverish urgency. The serene atmosphere of the forest had become charged with a grim energy, every shadow a potential clue, every rustle of leaves a sound of malevolent intent. The crime scene was immediately cordoned off. Forensic teams, summoned from the state capitol, arrived under the pale light of dawn. They moved with a quiet, efficient precision, their white suits and gloved hands a stark contrast to the untamed wilderness around them. They meticulously documented every detail, from the splintered wood of the nearby oak tree to the faint, almost imperceptible tire tracks in the soft earth. The boat was a silent witness, and they were its interpreters. They lifted it from its earthen grave, revealing a disturbing collection of items within its wreckage. The cooler, still latched, contained a few bottles of water and a bag of moldy sandwiches. A tattered blanket lay crumpled on the floor, and then they found the objects that truly shattered the remaining illusion of a simple accident. A single muddy hiking boot, its laces still tied, a cell phone, a relic of 2008, its screen shattered, its internal components ruined by the elements, a small silver pendant on a delicate chain, an intricate design of a dragonfly with tiny, polished stones for eyes, and finally, a small, rusted arrowhead, its once sharp tip now dull and pitted. The discovery of these objects, these mundane fragments of a life long lost, brought with it a renewed wave of sorrow and anger. They were not at the bottom of the lake. They were here in the cold, unfeeling embrace of the earth. But where were the victims? Where were Sarah, Mark, and Chris? The boat's presence on land was a powerful, unspoken contradiction. How did it get here? The nearest road was a quarter-mile away, and the terrain between the road and the discovery site was a treacherous labyrinth of steep hills, tangled undergrowth, and rocky outcrops. There was no clear path, no simple explanation. The initial hypothesis that the boat had somehow been washed ashore during a powerful storm was immediately discarded. The damage to the hull was not consistent with a simple collision with the shoreline. It was a direct, head-on impact, a deliberate act of violence against the vessel. The investigation, once a search for a missing boat and its occupants, had now become a full-scale homicide investigation. The theory of an accidental drowning was officially replaced by a far more disturbing narrative, a planned, calculated attack. But the questions multiplied with every new piece of information. Who would do this? Who would lure 3 friends into the middle of the woods, destroy their means of escape, and then make them vanish without a trace? The crime seemed to serve no purpose. There was no ransom note, no robbery, no clear motive. The lack of any struggle, any signs of violence in or around the boat was particularly perplexing. It was as if the three friends had simply stepped out of the boat and into thin air. The authorities, now with a new lead and a renewed sense of urgency, revisited every single interview, every single piece of evidence from the original investigation. The focus of their attention shifted from the water to the land, from the peaceful image of a boating accident to the dark, violent reality of a crime scene. But the true horror of the discovery was not just the boat itself, but what its presence implied. It was a message, a cruel and silent taunt from a killer who believed they had hidden their crime perfectly. For 6 years, they had been right. The disappearance had been a quiet, almost poetic mystery, a story of three friends lost to the vastness of nature. But now, with the chilling reality of a man-made horror exposed, the narrative had been shattered. The silent, unfeeling wilderness had become a graveyard, and somewhere, in the shadows, a killer was watching, confident that the truth would remain just out of reach. The discovery of the boat, its battered hull, a chilling monument to the violence that had taken place, did not provide the closure the families had so desperately sought. Instead, it only deepened the well of their despair and intensified the gnawing hunger for answers. The initial relief that the truth was now within reach was quickly replaced by a new, more profound dread. The case, which had once felt like a tragic accident, was now a calculated, cold-blooded act of malice. The media, which had largely forgotten the story, now descended upon the small, quiet town with a voracious appetite. The local news crews, then the national affiliates, and finally the true crime pundits who had made a career out of human misery. The names Sarah, Mark, and Chris were once again spoken aloud, their faces, once vibrant and smiling in old photographs, now plastered on television screens and newspaper front pages. The public fascination with the case was reignited, a morbid curiosity fueled by the dramatic twist in the narrative. The authorities, under immense pressure, had to revisit every single aspect of the investigation, every dead end, every discarded theory. The forensic teams, having scoured the boat and its surroundings, had found no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no definitive clues that pointed to a suspect. The tire tracks near the boat, while intriguing, were too faint and too common to be of any use. The case was a puzzle with a single crucial piece missing: the motive. Why would anyone do this? A robbery had been ruled out. All the victim's personal belongings, with the exception of the phone and a few other items, were not with the boat. The possibility of a random encounter with a violent individual seemed too improbable, too neat. The remote, secluded location of the boat suggested a premeditated act, but the complete lack of a struggle defied all logic. It was as if the victims had walked willingly to their deaths, a horrific and impossible thought. The investigators, led by a seasoned homicide detective named John Carter, began to construct a new timeline. They went back to the original statements of Jessica and Ryan, the two friends who had survived. Their testimony, once dismissed as the unreliable ramblings of two grieving youths, was now the central pillar of the investigation. They had been the last to see the three friends, the last to hear them speak. But their stories were maddeningly simple, devoid of any drama or conflict. The three had simply said they were going on a short boat ride and would return before dark. There was no mention of a destination, no hint of a plan that would lead them to a deserted stretch of shoreline. The most perplexing aspect of the entire case remained the presence of the boat itself. The only way it could have reached its final resting place was if it had been carried or dragged for a considerable distance. This suggested a powerful, determined individual, or, more likely, a group of accomplices. But who? And why the immense effort to conceal a crime that would have been so much easier to commit and hide on the water. The act of moving the boat inland was a theatrical gesture, a grotesque tableau meant to confuse and mislead. It was an act of cruelty, a calculated move to prevent the discovery of the truth. The investigators were now looking for a killer who was not just a murderer, but a malicious storyteller, someone who delighted in the manipulation of others. Their focus shifted from the external world of the crime scene to the internal world of the victims themselves. They delved into their personal lives, their relationships, their secrets. They interviewed their friends, their teachers, their acquaintances, searching for a single thread, a single piece of information that would explain the horror that had befallen them. They found nothing. Sarah, Mark, and Chris were, by all accounts, good kids. They were popular, well-liked, and had no known enemies. Their personal lives were as ordinary and uncomplicated as their last moments had seemed. The investigation was a relentless, grinding process of elimination. The number of suspects was narrowed down to a precious few, but each lead led to a new dead end. The lack of a clear motive, the absence of a single undeniable piece of physical evidence, was the ultimate stumbling block. The case of the Lake Clearwater Five, which had briefly flickered back to life, was in danger of returning to its cold, silent state. But Detective Carter refused to give up. He was a man with a singular focus, a relentless pursuit of justice that bordered on obsession. He spent hours poring over the old files, the grainy photographs, the transcribed interviews, searching for a detail that had been overlooked, a single word that had been misconstrued. He was looking for the ghost in the machine, the human element that had been so expertly scrubbed from the crime scene. He was haunted by the image of the boat, of the immense effort it must have taken to move it, to hide it. It was an act that spoke not of desperation, but of pride. The killer was confident, arrogant, and had made a single crucial mistake. He was certain of it. The case, he realized, was not about the absence of evidence, but the presence of a message. The placement of the boat was a deliberate act, a form of communication. But what was the message? What was the killer trying to say? It was a question that would lead him down a path of forensic analysis, of psychological profiling, and of a shocking revelation that would turn the entire case on its head and expose a secret that had been buried for 6 years. The narrative had not been shattered. It had simply been a carefully constructed falsehood, a prelude to a far more terrifying truth. The new lead came not from the police department, but from an unexpected source, the data analyst from Miller's search and rescue team, Chloe. While the investigators were focused on the physical evidence, the boat, the tire tracks, the lack of DNA, Chloe was fixated on a different kind of information. She had been tasked with a seemingly trivial detail, analyzing the footage from the drone's initial flight, not for what it found, but for what it captured in the periphery. She spent weeks meticulously poring over the thousands of high-resolution images, her eyes scanning for any anomaly, any small detail that might have been missed in the initial breathtaking discovery. It was a tedious, almost maddening task, a slow march through a digital landscape of green trees and brown earth. But Chloe, a woman who saw patterns where others saw chaos, believed that the truth was always hidden in the smallest details. She was not looking for a smoking gun, but for a shadow, a misplaced rock, a single insignificant piece of information that could unravel the entire mystery. And then she found it. Tucked away in a single frame, a wide-angle shot of the area surrounding the boat, was a faint, almost invisible detail. It was a patch of earth near the base of a towering pine tree, a place of deep shadow and tangled roots. The earth, she noticed, was not disturbed in the way one would expect from natural erosion. It was compacted as if something heavy had been repeatedly placed there. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible detail, but to Chloe it was a profound contradiction. She zoomed in, her fingers flying across the keyboard, enhancing the image, adjusting the contrast. The faint anomaly became a clear pattern, a series of indentations in the ground that seemed to radiate outward from a central point. It was not a burial site, not in the traditional sense. It was a place of activity, of repeated, deliberate action. She sent the image to Detective Carter, a short, terse email with a single subject line. "Look closer." Carter, initially skeptical, saw the image and felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. The pattern in the earth was too deliberate, too organized to be a natural phenomenon. It was an act of concealment, a grotesque game of hide and seek. He assembled a new search team, a small, highly trained group of forensic specialists, and returned to the site. They moved with a hushed, reverent air, their tools not the heavy machinery of a traditional dig, but the delicate brushes and trowels of an archaeological excavation. They knew they were not looking for a body, but for something far more complex, a second part of the narrative that the killer had so carefully constructed. The first discovery came less than an hour into the search. It was a small plastic flashlight, its exterior covered in dirt and grime, but its distinctive color, a vibrant, almost juvenile shade of yellow, was undeniable. It was the same flashlight that Jessica and Ryan had described in their initial interview, the one that Mark had brought with him on the trip. The discovery was a punch to the gut, a visceral confirmation that they were on the right track. They continued to dig, to brush away the layers of earth, their movements slow and deliberate. The second discovery was a crumpled cigarette pack, a brand that Chris had been known to smoke. And then the third, a small, tarnished compass, the kind you might find at a sporting goods store, its needle still pointing due north. It belonged to Sarah. The site was not a burial ground. It was a cache, a deliberate collection of the victim's personal belongings, buried with a chilling and meticulous precision. But why? Why go to the immense trouble of burying these items, only to leave the boat itself in plain sight? The answer, when it came, was a horrific, gut-wrenching realization. The compass, the cigarette pack, the flashlight, these were not just objects. They were messages, markers in a sick, twisted game. The location of each item corresponded to a specific point on an old, forgotten hiking trail that ran parallel to the road. The path had been so overgrown, so rarely used, that it had been completely overlooked in the initial searches. But to a local, a person who knew the land intimately, it was a clear path, a perfect way to transport the victims or their belongings without leaving a trace. The compass, still pointing north, was a subtle taunt, a reference to a long-held belief that the victims had simply lost their way. The cigarettes and the flashlight were also clues, a twisted breadcrumb trail leading to a final horrifying destination. The pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place, but the picture they were forming was more monstrous than anyone could have imagined. This was not a random act of violence, but a calculated ritualistic crime, a dark and intimate narrative that had been waiting to be discovered for 6 years. The killer was not a stranger, but someone who knew the land, someone who knew the victims, someone who was intimately familiar with the very wilderness that had been a silent witness to their disappearance. The discovery of the cache was not a moment of closure, but a chilling realization that the story was far from over. It was a prelude to the most terrifying question of all. If the boat and the personal items had been buried so carefully, what had happened to the bodies? The answer, they knew, lay somewhere in the silent, unfeeling earth, a final, horrifying truth that had been waiting for them all along. The hunt was now on, not for a missing person, but for a grave. The new understanding of the case, a narrative of ritualistic murder and calculated concealment, transformed the investigation from a desperate search for answers into a grim, methodical hunt for a grave. The discovery of the buried personal items was not just a clue, but a declaration, a silent challenge from a killer who had been confident in the permanence of their secret. The investigators, now with a new lead and a new sense of urgency, shifted their focus from the forest to the wider, more unforgiving landscape of the surrounding area. The theory was now clear. The killer had not intended for the boat to be found, but had used it as a distraction, a perfectly constructed alibi to lead the search parties away from the true crime scene. The buried items, a perverse breadcrumb trail, were a final chilling piece of the puzzle. The question was, what did they lead to? The answer, they believed, was a location so perfectly hidden, so utterly remote, that it had been missed in all the previous searches. The authorities, now working in a feverish frenzy, began to re-examine the vast, sprawling map of Lake Clearwater and its environs. They were no longer looking for signs of a struggle, but for signs of a grave, a place of finality. They brought in cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect the scent of human remains, and a team of ground-penetrating radar technicians, their equipment capable of peering into the earth itself. They followed the path of the overgrown hiking trail, a journey that led them deeper and deeper into the wilderness, away from any signs of civilization. The air was thick with humidity and the metallic scent of pine, but for the searchers it was filled with the ghosts of the past, the faint echoes of the three friends who had walked this path 6 years before. The search was a slow, agonizing process. The terrain was treacherous, the undergrowth dense and unforgiving. The cadaver dogs, their muzzles to the ground, worked with a tireless, almost mournful precision, but they found nothing. The ground-penetrating radar, an unblinking eye on the earth, revealed only the natural contours of the land, the endless layers of rock and soil. The frustration was a palpable thing, a heavy weight that settled over the entire team. They had been so close, so certain that they had finally unraveled the mystery, but the killer had been too clever, too meticulous. They had not left a single discernible trace. The investigation was in danger of stalling once again, the initial burst of hope fading into the familiar, gnawing silence of the cold case. But Detective Carter refused to give up. He was a man with a singular focus, a grim, unyielding determination. He went back to the cache site, to the small patch of earth where the personal items had been buried. He stood in the silence, his mind racing, searching for a single detail that had been overlooked, a single piece of the puzzle that was still missing. He was looking for the motive, the one element that could explain the incomprehensible cruelty of the crime. And then he saw it. Tucked away in a small, narrow fissure in a rock face near the cache was a single, crumpled piece of paper. It was a photograph, a small, faded print of a group of friends, their faces young and carefree, their smiles a vibrant testament to a life that had been so tragically cut short. But the photograph was not what caught his attention. It was the name on the back, scrawled in a delicate, almost childish handwriting. It was a name that had been mentioned in passing in the initial interviews, a name that had been dismissed as irrelevant. The name was Adam. Adam was the younger brother of Ryan, the young man who had survived the ordeal. He was a troubled youth, a loner with a history of disciplinary issues and a profound, almost pathological jealousy of his older brother's friendships. He had always been a quiet, unassuming presence in the background of their lives, a forgotten shadow. But now, with the chilling context of the crime, his silence took on a new, more sinister meaning. He had been at the lake that weekend, a fact that had been initially dismissed as a simple family outing. He had been a silent witness to the happiness and camaraderie of the group, a happiness that he had always been excluded from. The motive, so long a source of maddening confusion, was now horrifyingly clear. It was an act of jealousy, a twisted, adolescent fantasy of revenge against a group of friends who had possessed the very things he lacked: popularity, happiness, and a sense of belonging. The final damning piece of evidence, however, came not from the earth but from the air. A drone, a new, more advanced model with a thermal imaging camera, had been deployed to scan the entire area one last time. It was a Hail Mary pass, a last-ditch effort to find a single, irrefutable piece of evidence. And then, in a remote, almost inaccessible hollow far from the main trail, the drone's camera captured a single, searing image. A small, irregular heat signature, a faint, almost invisible glow against the cold, unfeeling earth. It was a patch of ground where a fire had been burned, a fire that had been so hot, so intense, that its residue was still detectable 6 years later. When the investigators dug, they found not a burial site, but a grotesque testament to the killer's final, unforgivable act. The earth was a charnel house, a grim and silent testament to a horrifying truth that had been waiting for them all along. The story of the Lake Clearwater Five was no longer a mystery. It was a tale of youthful jealousy, of a brutal act of violence, and of a calculated, almost theatrical attempt to conceal a truth that was, in the end, revealed by a new, more discerning eye. The silence of the lake was finally broken, but the sound that replaced it was not one of closure, but of profound, eternal sorrow.